Once again, welcome everybody to Unlocking the Lockdown Part 1. It's a series of webinars that we're going to do about coming out of this lockdown, and the first one is on health and safety. And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about that, the aspects of bringing people back to the workplace. My name, and I'll quickly move this on, is Luke Salmon. So there's a bio on me. The reason I'm running this is I specialise in HR recruitment, been at Michael Page for about 15 years, so I'm very lucky to talk to a lot of senior HR directors, and within a number of those conversations find out what's causing them most concern. And definitely what we found recently is that there are certain topics that are causing that concern, and this is one of them. I was keen to crack on by saying that the backdrop to this is little doubt. I think you've heard from everybody out there that we're in unprecedented times. We know that, and the world is adapting to sort of more complex human and economic realities as a result of Corona. But what's quickly become quite clear, I think, from talking to my HR contacts in those conversations, is that while complex going into the lockdown, it's nowhere near as complex as the issues of coming out of lockdown. And I think we've also become aware that there are so many different organisations of different sizes, affected, sorry about that, at a number of levels in a number of different ways. So we thought this would be useful. And I think the idea of the seminar was to bring you some practical or current and practical information at a time when things are changing very fast. We've been very lucky to partner with international law firm Squire Patton Boggs, who are also a very established UK law firm with offices across the country and very involved in UK law and what it means. And the first in the series of this is Unlocking the Lockdown. We've got a panel who I'll introduce to you in a second. But the first in the series is grappling with the issue of bringing people back to the office, which has definitely been the most topical thing that I've talked about with people who've gone along. Two things which are housekeeping. There's a chat function on the webinar, and you can add in any questions that you have for us in the panel. What we're going to attempt to do is have a question and answer session at the end and use those questions. So please send them in using the chat function, and we'll also have a questionnaire coming out after. So please let us know what you thought of it, and any ideas for something that would be very current, very topical. I'm sure you're getting a lot of invites to a lot of webinars, but please let us know, because we'd like to be on top of that. It's something that's really going to make a difference, and something that a conversation will help you with. We're very lucky to have a panel of people working in this area. I'll call them experts. I'm not sure they're going to jump in and say we're experts, but I think they are. We've got Samir Osman, who after 5 years working in trading standards has worked at Tesco in an operational risk and safety manager role, and is currently at Pret a Manger as the head of safety for the UK. We have, and I'm sure he'll introduce himself to you in a bit, Chris Spratt, who's been in facilities for over 20 years and held a number of roles within health and safety in that time. And at the moment, we're lucky to have him at Michael Page looking after our office space in the UK and abroad. And we also have the legal expertise of Rob Elvid, who is a partner at Squire Patton Boggs and is very much involved in investigations into health and safety, the environment, but also been working with a lot of clients, I understand, recently in relation to the health and safety aspects of coming out of this crisis. So the panel will be talking to you a little bit later, and Rob's going to be running through the law. So I've got a bit of an agenda which I can run through with you in a second, but I just wanted to explain the reason for this webinar. The reason for the webinar, we thought, was this is just not simple coming out of the lockdown. And there was a few things as I was doing my research, and it made me realise that I'm lucky I'm not in HR in health and safety at the moment, because there were so many different articles, so many things going on. What became quite clear is that there are two main issues that we need to discuss today. One is that we need to bring people back safely, but also to make them feel like they're safe. And on looking through my research, I came across one article which is about a meat plant where 70 workers had written an open letter which 700 other people had ascribed to, but they wanted to close the plant. In addition to that, they wanted it deep cleaned. They were demanding COVID tests. After that, they were also demanding certain measures were being put in place, but they also copied that letter into the health and safety executive. So I thought it was really interesting to see what's happening and how workers feel, and we all want them to feel safe to come back to work, but also to make sure they are safe. And the other element of this is obviously employers are going to be very keen to make sure that they're not laying themselves open to any sanctions. So we thought the law was quite important. And as we can see, the health and safety executive is very busy. Over the past 2 months, nearly 5,000 people have contacted them with workplace concerns. And in some of those cases, they've had to take steps and order employers to make safety improvements. In addition to that, they've extended their hours to make sure they're available for all the calls coming in. So the backdrop of that suggested that a webinar like this would be really useful. It's not a simple issue. I think some of you are not confused, but it's not clear what the rules are, where to start, and it keeps changing. So as a result of that, we thought this webinar would be very useful. But that's enough of me. Before we start, we're going to be running some polls, 3 of them. We thought it'd be best to understand our audience. So I was wondering if everybody, a poll will come up now, if you could quickly use the screen to confirm what type of workspace sits in your remit, which would be really useful for the panel to see. Then we'll hopefully be able to tailor our answers to that. So if you give us a couple of seconds when we get all the answers in, we'll be able to let you know, and I think Rob will be able to give you a guide on that. I think, yeah, I've got the details here, Rob. I'm not sure if you have.
Not okay. Well, it looks like the vast majority, 73%, look after office space only, which is a good steer. There's a little bit, 25% of you look after both production and office space, and it looks like there's a single person who looks after manufacturing and production.
On their own. So we've got a lot of office space people there, but we've got a good sort of quarter of our audience who are looking after both production and office. So hopefully we've got experts who look after those both areas, and Rob who knows the legal standpoint in these areas. So we should be able to cover most things will be as relevant as possible. So the agenda, before I pass over, is the first part of it is really to look at the law and what's mandatory, the regulations. Rob Elvin will help us with that. And then after that, we'll move to a session where we look at some questions we have and bring the panel in to discuss their thoughts around that. So how have you approached the problem, key considerations in manufacturing, key considerations in an office environment, followed by a Q&A session at the end. So that's the idea of this. Let's talk about the law first, then let's talk about the practical issues with the panel, and then let's move on to Q&A at the end of this. So I will pass you over. So this is about the rules and regulations, and I'll pass you over to Rob Elvin. So Rob, over to you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It's an interesting time to be a health and safety lawyer. Normally, organisations prefer not to have to speak to somebody like me. Phones have been ringing significantly in the last few weeks. I'm not going to go into huge detail around the law. It's really a few key messages. Luke, if you just forward the slide one further, I want to give you the framework really. And the first message is that the health and safety law has not changed. So the crisis has created a lot of guidance, a lot of commentary, a lot of talk, but it hasn't changed health and safety law at all. And our health and safety law framework in the UK is a well-established framework. I often describe it as an umbrella, where sitting at the top is the Health and Safety at Work Act, which sets out some general duties upon employers, also some duties upon employees. It generally sets out duties for employers to take all reasonably practicable steps so they don't expose their employees and others to risks to their health and safety. So that hasn't changed. That is the general duty. And what's interesting about that is that it requires you to take all reasonably practicable steps. And essentially it requires employers to work out for themselves what for its business those reasonably practicable steps are. And that's actually where the real challenge is going to be and is for all employers when they're seeking to comply with those general duties. I'm conscious that the poll showed that nearly 75% of you are from an office-based sort of environment, responsible for offices. And what I'm finding really interesting at the moment is that office environments historically are considered to be very low risk environments. And all of a sudden, because of the risk of COVID and the fact that it can be transmitted through congregations of people, for example, in an office, the low risk office environment has probably moved up into a medium or higher risk environment, which has sort of made those responsible for offices have to have a sort of long, hard look at whether their existing health and safety management systems are actually sufficiently robust to deal with this very significant high profile risk. So that's been quite interesting speaking to those responsible for offices in the last few weeks particularly. They're sort of realizing, hang on, we've got to actually look really hard at what we do with health and safety, because we've moved up 1 or 2 gears really in terms of our risk profile. Second thing I'd like to say, I think underneath that general duty Social Work Act, there are also a whole load of more prescriptive laws within regulations. But again, they've not changed. And so, for example, I'll come back to it, there is a set of regulations which we call the management regulations, and within there, that's where you find the duty with regards to having suitable and sufficient risk assessments, the duty to articulate sort of your arrangements, your safe systems, and also the duty to ensure that your people are sufficiently instructed and trained around the risks, around how they control the risks, so they can do their jobs safely. So that framework exists. It has existed for a long time. All employers should be very familiar with it. And the real objective now is to look at the COVID risk for your business and apply and work out what the relevant, reasonably practical steps, control measures are, so that you can ensure that your people are not exposed to the risk of contracting COVID within the workplace or their working environment. So that's sort of the key. Now, I just want to say a little bit about employees, because the duties are principally upon employers, but there are duties directly applied to employees. And it's quite an important time, I think, for employees to be reminded and encouraged to ensure that they do meet their own duties. And so the Health and Safety Work Act also has a duty on employees to basically carry out their jobs with reasonable care, so they don't expose themselves or others to risk. And additionally, they also have a duty to cooperate with their employers, so their employers can comply with their general duties. That can sometimes be forgotten, but it's a two-way street, so to speak, in terms of complying with duties. Employers and employees both have duties. If they both work actually together and collaborate, you maximize the opportunity to make sure that both sides of the equation are fulfilling the objectives. So it's important for employers to understand that employees as well also have health and safety legal duties. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about risk assessment, because since the COVID secure guidelines began to be articulated and released last week, there's been a huge amount of talk around the risk assessment process. From my perspective as a lawyer, in the same way as the law's not changed, good guidance and processes around risk assessment, they've not changed. And there's a plethora of very good guidance and good practice around the risk assessment process, which I just think or employer organizations just need to default to. And hopefully they've already got people, for example, health and safety advisors or their external competent advisor, who will just use the toolkits that already exist and the principles that already exist around risk assessment to make sure the risk assessment for COVID within organizations is suitable and sufficient. The reason it's so important is because that's your foundation. If you don't risk assess your risks properly, you haven't really got the best chance of ensuring that you get the right control measures to address the risks. So that's why it's right, I think, for the government to be highlighting the importance of the risk assessment. But just a few things about that. The HSE existing guidance, 5 steps to risk assessment, has a clear application now with COVID as it had before with general risks. Secondly, there's a lot of talk around the publication of risk assessments. That's not a law. It is not the law to put a risk assessment on the website, which is now within the guidance encouraged. We've got more than 50 employees. But there's certainly a challenge there if you don't, I think, publicize the risk assessment, because you'll just face more questions as to why you're not doing it. The fact that it's now becoming a public document, or certainly something which people might focus on and require to see sight of, also means you just better make sure you get it right. And there are a lot of organisations who are enlisting the help of sort of independent third parties to help them with that risk assessment, not least so they can say, well, hang on, we've looked at it properly, but we've also had an independent sense check of the risk assessment, and we're comfortable that it is suitably sufficient as the law requires. It's also important to note, I think, and this is, again, just good practice around risk assessment. The government has highlighted, no doubt because of some pressure with the unions, etc., but the need to consult with workers on risk assessments. Now, if you look at the 5 steps to risk assessment guidance, you will find best practice within there in any case around consultation with employees, around collaboration with the people who do the tasks where the risks may be. Actually, making sure that there's consultation with around the COVID risk assessment, I think is just good practice. Guidance, as I say, it's not the law, but where you've got a legal framework as we do, which sets out general duties and is not so prescriptive and leaves the duty holders to work out what they need to do to comply with the law, guidance takes a special place actually in health and safety law. You, as an employer, the burden's on you. There's what we call a reverse burden of proof under the Health and Safety at Work Act. It's on the employer to prove that it's taken all reasonably practicable steps. But if you've got guidance in existence relevant to the risks you're looking at, of course, there is now a whole host of guidance, some of which is industry sector specific. If you're not really following the guidance, I think it becomes more difficult to just prove that you've taken all reasonably practical steps. Strictly speaking, legally, you can do things other than what's in guidance, provided you can prove and establish they are reasonably practical steps to take. But I think following, adhering to guidance just gives you a greater sense of comfort that you have a better argument that you are, as I say, taking all reasonably practical steps. So that's just a little bit about risk assessment, a little bit about why the burden is on you to be very much looking at your risk assessment and your control measures. I think it is sensible to bring in external support for that sense check, that independent view. Just one final thing about sort of the law before I move on to sort of the practical side is the HSE's position. And Luke used a slide earlier, which sort of highlighted some work the HSE are doing and getting involved in. I've been dealing with the HSE and their enforcement side for 20 years. They are very, very good at what they do usually, but they've always been under-resourced. And actually, over the last 3 years, a lot of resources come out of the HSE, and same with other regulators, the Environment Agency, and actually moved into the Brexit campaign, so to speak. The HSE have been given £14 million to help it with COVID. That won't go very far. I'm interested to see that their hours of work have been extended because it's very much 9 to 5 historically. I wonder just how much they can actually achieve to do the spot checks, the investigations, etc., that the government have alluded to if employees complain about employer practices. So it's going to be very difficult for the HSE to enforce. And actually, if you look at what Sue Alman, the chair of the HSE, is saying, it's a soft enforcement approach that they're advocating, which I think is, in these circumstances, very sensible. So they will certainly pick up complaints from employers about employers and investigate subject to their resource. I think that will mean they will continue to use their fees for intervention powers if they were to find material breaches when they go into workplaces, factories, offices, wherever it may be. But it's very clear that what they're going to try to do is not take the sort of more draconian route around enforcement, such as prosecution, but you make greater use of advisory letters, possibly improvement notices, and in cases where they think organisations are just doing the wrong thing and exposing people to risk, they may go as far as a prohibition notice, stopping an organisation from doing what they were doing. But I think it will be very, very rare, and probably the cases where they just think the employers are carrying on recklessly. I don't think you'll see much in enforcement in the shape of prosecution. I think it will be much more the carrot than the stick. So that's sort of the legal side and the framework and how it works and how COVID might fit in to that framework. Just want to talk a bit about some of the practical things that we've been hearing from client organisations about the control measures, the reasonably practicable steps that they've been considering and their approach around making workplaces, particularly offices, more safe. And we'll build upon these in the panel later. So essentially, we've been sort of hearing about almost an essential 6 areas that organisations have been focusing on. The first one is sort of getting, and this is when you're going back to work, i.e. not the organisations that have carried on operating through the crisis, but getting the building, getting the premises ready to take employees in. Now, some of your offices and buildings may have been sort of almost mothballed for 2 or 3 months. So it's important that organisations actually make sure that they're ready to come back online, those buildings, and that, you know, ventilation systems and the like have all been tested and are working safely. There's obviously a need, with, you know, to get the buildings clean, which I'll return to. Equally, if you're going to change any processes and systems, which you may have to in light of your COVID risk assessment, there may be some adaptations to the building that are required. And equally, one shouldn't forget that there should already be a suite of risk assessments applicable to your building and what you do in it, which again might just need to be reviewed prior to getting people back in. And I would give particular attention to the fire safety rules and certification, etc. Make sure that is brought up to date in light of any changes to how it's going to work. So preparing the building is the first thing I think that's very, very important to consider even before you get people in it. So the next area, which is touched on the next slide, is, you know, having prepared your building, you've got to prepare your workforce. You get your people ready to be sort of safely. Now, there's quite a lot of, I think, focus that needs to be given to making sure those that manage teams, etc., in an office environment, etc., have had sufficient training to know what your systems are going to be, and also to manage the people issues. And we've just flagged one of them around are your managers sufficiently familiar with what the symptoms of COVID are, such that they can be talking and checking with their teams as to whether or not anyone is displaying symptoms. Bear in mind, very recently, in the last couple of days, you know, a third symptom, loss of smell, loss of taste, has been added to what had been originally the sort of the 2 main ones around temperature to be focused on. So the 2 have become 3. So that's very, very important. And you do have to make sure and be able to evidence that you've got more people, I suppose, trained, educated in some of the key COVID secure principles. We're talking about washing hands. Now, don't presume that all of your employees are washing their hands, are following the PHE guidance. And I think it's very sensible for employers to be providing some of the key guidance that coming out of PHE and the government directly to employees. Just as much as anything else, I'm a defence lawyer who likes to be able to prove things. You can prove that your employees knew what they were supposed to be doing. So very much around hand washing, cleanliness, hygiene, obviously social distancing. These are all the things which you just need to make sure your employers are aware of. And that's before you get onto your new systems of work. Things which we thought when we were seeing risk assessments that were being forgotten about, first aid cover, emergency medical care, they were being left out of COVID secure risk assessments. So just flag that something to be particularly aware of. And also, call it here, the supervision, I might call it the policing of COVID secure sort of arrangements. It's always very important, not just to create new systems of work, but to ensure that they're followed. And actually, very often like to see evidence that an employer is managing and supervising and reviewing the systems to make sure that they're working. So those are just a few things around preparing the workforce that we're hearing from clients about. Other particular areas of focus, which I think do match principles of COVID-19 secure. You know, look for key areas of premises where transmission of the virus might be sort of more prevalent or potentially more prevalent. Look at your control entry points, look at your doorways. Do you need to have hand sanitizers either side of a doorway? The doors have to close, and of course some doors have to be closed under, for example, fire safety regulation. So look at these areas within your buildings to see where the main touch points are, and try to control access as best you can. Probably most office environments will have a prohibition or certainly a restriction on visitors, etc. And also, I know there's a lot of work going into making sure hygiene and sanitation and hand washing facilities are increased for workforces. So just a few things there around controlling the access to the buildings. The next slide obviously is a key focus area. It's been part of the government's plan almost from the get-go, and it is one of the key principles coming out of COVID secure guidance. It's 2 meter social distancing. I mean, interestingly enough, in other jurisdictions, it's not necessarily 2 meters. In America, they use it's the old-fashioned 6 foot. I think in Belgium it's 1.5 meters. I've heard of another country it's just 1 meter. So 2 meters is very cautious. But that's our government, that's the guidance, and I think for a UK employer, that's what you need to be following. So you need a social distancing plan, and you need your employees to understand it and to follow it. And the guidance itself, as you can see, is alluding to various parts of what might inform a plan. Not necessarily having all of your teams coming back to work at the same time. Shifts, cohort systems are being looked at a lot. Equally, the guidance does recognise that there might be tasks where you can't guarantee your people are more than 2 meters away. So I had a client who actually carried on working because of one of the energy companies producing energy, and they had certain lifting tasks, manual lifting tasks, where they have to be 2 people lifts. They were going to be within 2 meters, so they had to devise a system of trying to address that. So the government talks about making sure people face away. This is where face coverings may be even more relevant. Of course, that is a key area which is changing in time. Anyway, we'll discuss it later. But the use of face coverings and face masks, etc., is becoming more prevalent in guidance and in practice, as far as I can see. But to get this 2 meter or 6 foot office, as some people have called it, you are going to have to consider redesigning, even if on a temporary basis, the workspaces, and you're going to have to work out, as the schools are at the moment, how many people can you safely get in certain areas. And I know my own office, for example, very much looking at creating one-way systems in corridors. So just some of the things around social distancing that employers need to talk about. We'll just move on to the next slide, please, Luke. I've probably touched upon some of this already. The cleaning regimes are hugely important. I think it's quite important to note that there's a slight change actually in some of what the government is saying about cleaning, but they obviously need to be more frequent. You need to focus on the higher contact areas. You need to provide more hand washing facilities. But there's now almost a 2-stage part to cleaning and hygiene, which focuses on the clean and the disinfectant. So that's been a relatively recent change to the guidance. And what I'll say about that, actually, because it raises another point, please keep on top of the changing guidance. And whenever you make decisions, or so whenever you're working out your COVID-19 risk assessment, please capture the guidance you relied upon at the time. Because what's happening, and this is happening in other areas, for example, the furlough schemes, the government change guidance regularly, and they take off the websites the earlier guidance that you might have relied upon, which means it becomes more difficult if you haven't captured it and stored it to prove that your decision at the time was based upon guidance. So that's a tip I'd give about making sure whenever you make decisions based upon guidance, be it the government's or other guidance, capture it, store it in your electronic management system, particularly as most of us can't necessarily print off at home anymore. Please don't lose sight of the changing dynamic nature of guidance as well. So the last area I would just say is coming from the clients as part of what the reasonably practicable steps are is on the next slide, which is around communication. Uber important. The government have flagged it with the consultation points around the risk assessment. I just think organisations who get the best risk assessments and therefore the best management systems for safe working environments have done it through collaboration with their teams. It might be the Health and Safety Committee. Some of you may already have these in place, or it might just be through a COVID risk team that's created for this process. I've seen a lot of organisations creating COVID-19 officers, COVID-19 designated officer or lead project manager. I think that's a very good idea as well, and using them to be communicating with relevant groups and teams. And having a champion at board level, well, that's something which features in the guidance leading health and safety at work, which is the HSE and IOD Institute Directors guidance to boards as to how they should be involved in health and safety generally. Probably no more or more important time is now to have or be able to prove that the board are engaged with health and safety, are involved with the COVID-19 secure arrangements. And so having a champion at board level, I think, is also very, very important. It's not the law, but it certainly would be best practice. And as you go on, because guidance changes, because we learn more and more about this COVID-19 risk, please make sure that the organisation is open to reviewing its risk assessment, therefore reviewing its control systems. There's actually a legal obligation to review risk assessments if there's a material change in your business, and learning, for example, that there are now antibody testings which can be relied upon, and so that employers can look at testing and tracing as part of their own systems rather than the national system. That's something which may well come in 2, 3, 4 weeks and have to become part of your control measures because they've all of a sudden become reasonably practicable, whereas maybe today, certainly 2 weeks ago, testing by a private organisation, individual employers, wasn't, I don't think, necessarily reasonably practical. To be aware of those changing guidance, changing knowledge, feedback from your employees would be very important in case they sort of identify risks not previously thought about, and make sure you've got a dynamic health and safety management system able to respond to this current challenge. So that's what I wanted to cover really in terms of what the law is at the moment, how COVID-19 might fit into it, and what some of the reasonably practicable steps clients and organisations are looking at in order to be able to put together their response to COVID and prove that they have taken all reasonably practicable steps.
Thanks, Rob. That was a very swift and concise summary of a complicated area of law. Thank you very much. Rob will be obviously part of the panel. But there was one question that came up. I think you said, please keep in touch with changing guidance. Where would you suggest they keep in touch with changing guidance? Would that be the government website or health and safety? Where would be the best place to keep looking?
Well, certainly the government guidance, because, well, there's 2, 3 government agencies I think you need to be on top of. And bear in mind, most of them have alert systems now. So the government's own coronavirus hub, so to speak, allows you to sign up to get any development that they release. Now, you've got to be ready for getting 25 emails a day at the moment because it's roughly about that. But government coronavirus guidance, PHE, which is slightly separate guidance, and the Health and Safety Executive. They are all the 3 key bodies that I would say someone in the organisation needs to be monitoring it. Use their email alert systems because it makes it easier to find what's coming from where, and then just trying to, and this is a difficult bit, trying to spot what's changing. The government do tell you when they've updated it and what and where they've updated it, so that's quite helpful. But those are the key areas I focus on. That said, I look at what's being said in other countries. I think the CDC in the US announced or publicized a 60-page document yesterday, the first one of, I think, of its detailed type, which, if you look at that, gives some similar sort of principled guidance to operations in some sectors, and that's worth looking at just to see if they're doing something different which might work for your business. Equally, we get feedback from countries which might be slightly further down the journey than the UK. So I can tell you now, for example, that if you look at what's going on in professional football in the UK, they have been monitoring very closely what control measures have been put in place by the German Bundesliga. and and that is as good for office spaces or other sectors. Those countries which have started to go back earlier than the UK, there's some good learning really from those countries as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we're going to come on to sort of experiences at offices outside the UK or countries where we've got offices outside the UK. But I'll bring all the panel in now for a first question that's come up. And someone, they specifically addressed it to you, Rob, which it works quite well. We've got everybody here. So it was more about how do you approach this? Where do you start? There's lots of different guidelines. I think you've talked about them. But one specific question that came up, was going to save it until the end, was, Rob, if I've never had a risk assessment in an office space, can you give me advice on where you start, where I'd find a toolkit?
Yeah, question that a lot of office-based businesses have been asking. Actually, what we've been doing with many clients is we've been directing them towards the Northern Irish Health and Safety Executive, because they have put together a template for a COVID risk assessment. So that sets out a pretty standard and familiar, relatively simple risk assessment template, and helps because it already identifies some key risks which would be applicable to an office around COVID. So we've used that in many respects. A lot of my clients have already got their existing suite of risk assessments, and they've simply taken that template and applied just the COVID-19 risk in the office environment. It's not that difficult to find template risk assessments generally. Certainly not these days. It gets put on the web. But I always try to default. What's the regulator going to expect? And that's why I've been using the Northern Irish Health and Safety Executive template. I haven't checked in the last couple of days. I don't think the HSE in England and Wales have actually provided a template yet, but that Northern Irish one is a good place to start.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. And I'd probably move over to Samir. I imagine with Brett, you've been working through this. I suppose before we move on to the risk assessment, where did you start the process when this all happened?
So, I mean, at Pret, we've undertaken a bit of a phased opening plan. So it was a bit of a, let's test the water, let's open up a handful of shops. I think for us, and my way of thinking was very much, let's go for a belt and braces approach. So let's look at all the controls that we can possibly introduce to our business. Let's then look at what we can reasonably and practically implement, and then build on the risk assessment that way. So it's basically been very much around a process of elimination. I think also, as Rob has said, it's to get key people on board. So it was to try and establish a key stakeholder group. Of course, in our environment, we've got our shop teams and we've got all the respective support centre departments. So it was really to ensure that we had a broad, broad representation as part of this stakeholder group. And it was very much ensuring that everything that we were doing, we were aligned. And I think that's really, really key. There's no point HR doing something around return to work policies, operations doing something around opening plans, without there being consistency and without there being a joined up approach. So this is where I feel having a stakeholder group is really, really important. And what I do at Pret is I host the stakeholder team meeting every week. And it really is a sense check, and it's an opportunity to review our current controls, where we are in terms of government guidance, what we need to relax, and what we can, what we need to step up. So I would suggest that's very much the key thing.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, and that's good sort of experience of doing it. Chris, where are you at with your starting point?
Sure. I mean, it's very, very similar. The stakeholder group, the sort of planning committee was essential, and we kicked off with that with key players, facilities, HR, a representative from the operational side of the business, and marketing. You might think, well, why marketing? But I think in all of this, internal communication is going to be absolutely essential as you prepare your colleagues coming back into what is going to be a vastly different workplace environment. we also kicked off with looking at the magnitude of the challenge. So we're not going to bring everyone back into the office at any one point in the near future. Some people will remain on furlough, some people remain working from home, and clearly if we're going to achieve some social distancing in the workplace, a checkerboard approach to desk allocation is probably going to be the significant change people will experience when they come in. Therefore, we looked at what our office capacities will be in the future. So to give a guide to our occupancy, that then gives us an idea of just what other measures, say in circulation spaces or shared spaces, kitchens, breakout, etc., what measures will require to maintain social distancing. And that is really guiding how we're planning the changes to our workplace.
How are you going from there? There was one, I was going to keep most of the questions to the end, but this one came up while Samir was talking, is that someone asked, how long did it take from initially deciding that you'd embark on a reopening to actually opening your first premises?
So, you know, we always envisage that these things will take, it will take no time at all, but actually it took us about 4 to 5 weeks to get this over the line. So it was not only embarking on doing the risk assessment, understanding the level of risks and the controls that are required, but I guess it's more about the engagement, the communication. It's how do we formalise that into something that's easily, that we can easily convey to our shop teams, those people that were currently, that were on furlough, to the stakeholder groups that are very much part of the reopening plans. What we've done is we've done very practical things, like we've produced a reopening manual, which basically specifies all of our controls. In addition, for things like the wearing of face masks, stepping up cleaning, we've produced how-to cards, which are very, very simple to understand, very pictorial, and really just is a summary, quick reference guide to our teams to understand how they adopt and how they manage these controls within their shops. Again, it's working with HR, so it's bringing in all their policies that have been collectively agreed into one central space. And that has worked for us. It was a lot of work up until the point that we got it over the line, and actually then it became really quiet. And I think that was a really good indication that things are working. Supervision and management is key. It's all very well having these controls in place, but there needs to be an element of due diligence and those checks. So what we've produced is literally formal due diligence checks just around those additional controls. So our team leaders, our managers, and our managers on duty within shops are tasked with ensuring that those checks are completed on a daily basis. And again, they provide full visibility of that, so we're able to see where there are pinch points, whether shops need further support, and actually whether the controls are right and what support and further enhancement is required.
So it sounds like a lot of work getting that shop open, but after that, when everything's in place, it's run more smoothly.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing now is really the comments that are coming from our customers. Clearly, we've gone for, we've got a whole suite of different controls within our business. But some of our customers, when they go in, they can see that our team members are perhaps not adhering to social distancing rules, and they're challenging us on that. And my response would always be, look, the government guidance, I believe, has been very woolly. I think the only consistent message has been the 2 metre social distancing rule. But what I always say to our customers, and we've created some frequently asked questions for them, is that we have a whole suite of controls that hopefully goes towards negating the viral transmission. Therefore, if you see a couple of colleagues that are not abiding to the 2 metre social distancing rules, that doesn't mean that they are flouting rules or flouting guidelines or going against our own policies. We have other things in place, and I think that's really important to make clear.
Yeah, so sort of communication to the customers as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'll move on, because I know that we can get through a few questions, but I'll come back to some questions at the end. So the next thing we wanted to do was a poll. Once again, it'll take a few seconds, but risk assessments. We were keen to find out, before we move on to risk assessments, who's intending to publish their risk assessment. Oh, the numbers are changing. I'll move on to the next question where we've got this, which is all part and part. Okay, I think we're nearly there. I think. So we have a poll. I don't know, Rob, if you're able to communicate.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this question because fascinated by why the government will requiring this in the guidance. But the poll suggests 62% are intending to publish it with the workforce only. You have to say, I think that's the most important place to publish it. 19% publish it with the workforce and on the website, and 20% don't intend to publicize it. So that's interesting.
That is interesting. It moves on to sort of our next question was around the risk assessment. So I think we've done a bit about how you've gone about assessing it, but I'd be keen to hear from you, Samir and Chris as well, but also particularly how you've interpreted the government guidelines to consult employees and trade unions when you're doing your risk assessments. So I don't know, pass that on to Chris first, or let you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Jump.
I mean, we don't have a particularly unionised environment here, but I think as our plans mature, we're going to use line management. We're going to be informing our colleagues as to what our plans are, and through appointing office champions in addition to line management, we're going to get the cascade of information back up from our colleagues as to whether they have any concerns or questions. Like Samir, we'll probably issue an FAQ, a suite of information, or go about a reinduction to the workplace. And I think that's going to be the principal tool of downward communication, but also very much encouraging our employees to ask questions and raise concerns. We have Yammer in the business, which is a fantastic tool to facilitate bilateral communication, and I'm sure we'll be using that as and when the time comes. We are relatively early in our planning, lots of work going on behind the scenes. We're probably a week or 2 weeks away from getting those plans into some form of solidity that we can start sharing with our workforce.
And Samir, did you get involved in, as I say, taking guidance from employees and trade unions when you were putting the risk assessment together?
Yeah, so again, we don't, we haven't got trade unions, not heavily publicised, but I think, again, just as Chris said, it was very much getting people on board to understand what those controls were. In terms of communications, we have various communication streams. So we have our daily comms, which is, if we are changing some controls, if we're stepping up controls, if we're relaxing controls, that's sent out on a daily basis. We have our weekly comms, which is a reminder of what our current controls are. And also, again, just in line with government guidance, our general managers in shops are expected to actually physically talk to teams by doing a team brief every 2 weeks, reminding them of what their controls are and how those controls are checked. In terms of risk assessments, we've gone about this in a very, very simple way. In terms of assessing the risk, I think it's more about the controls that you need to have with it to fit the environment. Our risk assessment journey has changed, and we've actually got 2 versions of risk assessments. We've got one that goes up to our team members and to our support office staff. This risk assessment has also been used to try and appease landlords when we want to reopen shops. It's also been furnished to our primary authority, which we feel is a key stakeholder. What I've tried to do is to get assured advice from our primary authority, really to sign off that our COVID-19 controls are sufficient in the event of any regulatory or enforcement action. In light of the recent government guidance and the virus threat levels, I've then taken those controls and almost mapped out what needs to be in place and what doesn't be in relation to those different levels. So for example, what we need at level 5, clearly we don't need at level 1. And I've found actually that this is a really good internal document to use. So rather than having to re-engage with the group, rather than having to look at, to discuss heavily and in depth what we need to relax and what we need to step up, that is all mapped out on this risk assessment document. And that's been collectively agreed, and we revisit that on a weekly basis to make sure that we are, we know exactly where we are in terms of the government threat levels and exactly what, levels of checks are required. We will not be publicising that purely because it's an internal document and we don't want to be held to account. It is something that we use as a guide. It's a very robust document, but at this point, we feel that our generic, version 1 risk assessment is sufficient. So that's, so again, on a practical basis, it might be worth, people looking at adopting that approach. For our level 5, we've said that we will consider a shop closure, which would very, very much depend on what government requirements are. But within that, we've also looked at what other controls do we need. So how can we stay open, but what other controls can we implement that again go over and above what we've currently got?
All right, brilliant. And just a quick question for Rob. We looked at the poll. Do you have to publish a risk assessment? I know 20%.
Not according to the law, no.
Right.
You have to communicate with your people, with your employees, what their risks are, and that's why many organisations do share their risk assessment or relevant risk assessments with employees. But there's no law which says you must publish openly, publicly, your risk assessment. My understanding is that was driven by negotiations between trade unions and the government. I think it's a practical issue, really. If you don't publicise it, you might find more scrutiny being applied to you by people who like to apply scrutiny in social media or whatever. I think it becomes a public relations issue if you choose not to publicise it. I've been helping one of the Premier League football clubs with their return to training, and they are so high profile. You just know that someone in the media is going to start to say, well, where's your general risk assessment for COVID? Because the government say you must publish it. And although they might not want to and might not have to legally, in reality, they just know the pressure of not doing so on them means that they've only got one option, really, which is to publicise it.
Practically, things to consider. I'll move on because I know we've got some other questions. So this has come in. It's how have you as a panel approached the issue of employees commuting to work? Is there a duty of care there? And what have you done in relation to helping them with their commute to work or making it safer?
So I kick off on this one.
Yeah. Go for it, Chris.
We haven't that many people going back to work just yet. We are looking at it. I think it's debatable whether you have a duty of care at that point, but I certainly think there was a moral obligation and clearly a desire to support and look after your colleagues. So I think there's clear government advice now. I think about face covering on public transport, not surgical masks, but some form of face covering. And the repeated hand sanitizers, washing hands. So I think we just, we're intending to say to our colleagues, if you are commuting by public transport, continue to follow that advice. But I think most importantly, if you're not comfortable coming into the office by public transport and you don't have other means to get into the office, then we take the view that you continue to work from home. So I think until it is effectively much safer to come in on public transport, we're not intending to force people to use it.
Right. Samir, did you take a different approach?
Likewise. I guess for us, it's we've got the office teams and we've got our shop teams, and of course, when our shops are open, we expect our shop teams to be in shops. So initially, when we opened up a handful of shops, we actually set up taxis for our teams to get to work and back home in the evening. Obviously, that's not sustainable. So what we've done is we've made face masks available. So, you know, we determined actually, because there's no validation in terms of, you know, whether they're effective in terms of viral transmission, that we have made non-surgical, non-PPE face masks available to our team members. They can choose to wear them purely voluntary in our shops whilst they're working. That's front of house and back of house. But also very much, you know, for their commute home and back into work the following morning. So that's how we've approached it. I think for our office teams, it will very much be based on, you know, coming to the office when it's not rush hour. So, you know, come in when you feel like it. It's very, very flexible, and yeah, and I think, but you know, behaviour breeds behaviour. I think that, you know, we were umming and ahhing initially with regards to face masks and what the public perception would be, but actually now I think as this pandemic has evolved and has become more established, the expectation is that from our customers that our team members wear face masks. So we're even looking at visors as well and other PPE. So, you know. So yeah, I guess we just need to stay abreast. It's not just about safety, but it's about yeah, the public perception, PR, and also staff welfare as well from a HR perspective.
Right.
I think it's all about assurance, you know, providing people with that assurance.
Sorry, I jumped in then, Chris, when you were speaking.
Sorry. No, just the part of it is perception, but I think it's also just giving employees the assurance, you know, a choice. You know, protection is in place, and certainly in regards to commuting, it's great to talk about staggering times and what have you, but just need to make sure we monitor that, because if every business starts to stagger their commuting times, we'll all end up coming in at 10 o'clock rather than at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So it's constant monitoring of change and adapting procedures as this moves forward.
Imagine a communication between businesses is going to be important in that aspect, which I imagine is a whole different discussion. But I was going to ask quickly, Rob, whether there was a duty of care about people coming into work on their journey into work, their commute, that we should be aware of.
Really interesting legal question. I mean, historically, there certainly hasn't been. How someone gets to work is a matter for them, and your sort of duty of care starts once they are in the workplace, wherever that may be. I think I don't think there's a duty, even with COVID, to get involved in stipulating what the mode of transport is. I mean, the government guidance stands for what it is. Where I think that there could be an argument that there's a duty of care is that you may need to consider, as part of your risk assessment control measures, how your employees are getting to work, because that could increase the risk to your business. So if you have a lot of people using public transport, for example, that might increase the risk of people bringing to your workplace the virus. So that's about as far as I think the duty of care would go, to consider whether it increases your risk profile. I don't think there's a duty of care to stipulate safe methods of transportation to the workplace.
Brilliant. Thank you. I realise that everybody probably put this out for an hour. We're a little over time, so I'll move on to our final poll, which will be interesting to see. Is are you issuing face masks to staff in your current organisation? So we can interesting to see what people say. The numbers are getting there. Interesting. We have some numbers. They should collate now. Okay, Rob, I don't know if you've got the details there.
Well, I just find this whole thing very interesting. Never before has PPD been spoken about so much. So nearly 50%, 47% is no, we're not issuing face masks. 25% are in the office only. 8% commute, and 20% for commute and the office. But nearly half are not issuing face masks.
Which is an interesting statistic.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. That may change if government guidance changes, and it does seem to be changing in time. Spain have now, I think, updated their guidance, making it compulsory for virtually everybody when you're outside. So yeah, watch the space, I think, about PPE and face masks.
One of those ones to keep an eye on, as you said, for changing circumstances. But it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, what I would say, if I saw a question come in earlier, you know, if you deem it the right control measure within your business and an employee refuses to wear a face covering or face mask, that is arguably in breach of that employee's health and safety duty under Section 7. And equally, it's probably a refusal to adhere to a reasonable management instruction, might be a disciplinary matter. So that was a specific question earlier. So if it's the right thing to do, so if it's a reasonable instruction and a reasonable control measure, then really your employees shouldn't refuse to wear masks. And if they do, it's potentially a disciplinary matter.
Yeah, I saw that question earlier. So it was around. Oh, yeah, I'll come back to it later. Yeah. So I think we were moving on to sort of a couple of key questions. I think, Samir, you might be able to help here. There are some people who've got production environments. Were there any key challenges or changes that you thought were important in that kind of environment?
Yes, I think back of house has been particularly challenging. Within our shops, we make all our products fresh, or most products fresh on the premises. So we don't have central kitchens, we don't have dark kitchens, we don't have central production units. So what we've done is we have had to really slim down our menus. So, you know, in a normal prep shop, we have 50, 60 products, a variety of products available. We have slimmed those down considerably to a handful, just so that eases production. That requires less people in the back of house areas. And what we've actually done is physically move benches to ensure that when people are at benches making products, they are adhering to the 2-metre social distancing rule. So that's been the biggest challenge, particularly where we've got kitchens that are particularly small. Also, we have stepped up checks within those back of house areas. We've also put the onus very much on our colleagues to ensure that they, you know, saying that they are responsible for ensuring that social distancing rules are adhered to. But also practical things like, you know, when people are walking into walk-in chillers or walk-in fridges, we have a person that is able to do that on behalf of the people that are making the products. We've also, you know, procured small fridges to put them next to benches so that ingredients are easily accessible and limit the movement of staff. So I think that has been the biggest challenge. And also front of house, you know, as footfall increases, you know, the pressure on myself as a safety individual from the business is how can we relax social distancing rules at the front of house? How, you know, can we get more people in? Can we get more people at the barista stations and at till stations to help with, you know, with that footfall and servicing of customers? So it's all things that we need to think about. But yeah, I would say that has been the biggest challenges. In terms of the, you know, the most important changes that we have made or will make, there are lots of learnings from this. You know, there's a number of things that we could adopt going forwards, even when we're out of this pandemic situation, and hopefully when coronavirus has disappeared, there are certain things that we will be keeping in place. Things like the plexiglass barriers are a really good control. Things like stepping up cleaning and sanitisation front of house and frequent washing of hands front of house. Again, another great control that we should be implementing going forwards.
So I promise not to lose, but another question has come up 2 or 3 times, but people have asked, is it essential to have a first aider on the floor at all times in both environments if you're going to have a reduced workforce? And maybe that's one for Rob, or maybe if you've thought about that one for Chris and Samir.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that is very much based upon your first aid risk assessment, and that is dictated by the type of environment. It may be in lower risk environments that having an appointed person or competent person who just coordinates first aid arrangements is sufficient. It really does depend upon your risk assessment.
I would also say that you know, if you're in shared buildings with other businesses, maybe you can rely on a resource to service all those businesses. In our shops in particular, our policy is that we will have a first aider on duty on every shift whilst the shop is open. and we've hit a brick wall with regards to the expiration of first aid qualifications. What we've done is we've sought advice from our first aid provider. The HSC has given guidance that for any first aid qualification that can be extended for 3 months, as long as you're able to show that your teams know what they need to do in the aid of first aid provision is required. So we've sought some videos, given a refresher by getting our team members to watch this video, and we deem that to be sufficient. But that's a key consideration, particularly in shops. How do you manage that, and what should be, and how do you make that sustainable? In addition, I think also it's important for teams to understand what to do if there is a person that is exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms, if there's a team member, if there's a customer that collapses on the floor and has said, I'm not feeling very well. So again, to include that within your training and making sure that the staff are completely up to date on how to deal with, with people with potential COVID-19.
I think that's a very important point in your risk assessment on site. You have to assess the risk to first aiders. By their very nature, they're going to have to get up close and personal to someone who requires assistance, depending on the circumstance. So absolutely, that needs to be assessed and suitable, sufficient control measures put in place.
Such as PPE or other equipment.
Yeah, it could be PPE, gloves, instantly going to wash hands straight afterwards, or all that sort of stuff. And again, it really just depends upon the circumstances.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate time. So everyone, a lot of people are in an office. So I just was quickly keen to see were there any key challenges. I know Rob talked quite eloquently through offices. Any key challenges that you've seen there for the health and safety that you'd highlight, and any important changes you felt you needed to make? And I'd probably pass that to Chris. I know Samir's got an office as well.
From our perspective, we talked a lot about it already, but I think one of the key challenges in multi-tenanted buildings is coordination. There's a duty to cooperate and coordinate between different tenants and the landlord anyway, but whatever plans a business may come up with, particularly if you have multi-site portfolio, is trying to dovetail your plans in with what the landlord or managing agent's going to do. There's no point going off in divergent direction. So I think one of the challenges is going to be coordinating with other entities in buildings.
All right. Samir, did you find anything similar when it came to your head office? In terms of
we're very much governed by our landlords, so yeah, they have given us guidance. I think in terms of the practical controls that we have in the office, we've got directional signing. We've implemented, we've said that there'll be no more hot desking. So we've sent out a survey to our teams. We need to understand whether they need to come back to the office because their job role requires it, or whether they want to come back to the office because they could have been in a room and haven't got the right facilities, internet access, or just concerned for their general welfare. And on that basis, we have made our plans based on the number of people that want to come back. So we've allocated desks to those individuals. We've said, don't use lifts, use stairs. Meeting rooms will be out of use. Continue to use, the virtual team meetings. We've implemented a no contractors, no visitors coming into the office. Practical things, little things like using disposable cutlery and cups rather than the glassware and china. And again, I think the thing is to avoid rush hour, so it's very, very flexible, and we've got very limited opening times. So yeah, I think it is just more for staff to be able to check in and to do bits that they can't ordinarily do at home. But the default option is certainly to stay at home if you can.
And I'll come to that question a little bit later. There's definitely been a question about the health and safety of people that are working from home. So Rob, I don't know if there's anything else for your offices in an office environment that you thought would be a key challenge or a key change before moving on?
The key challenge at the moment is managing people's expectations. Because of the messaging from the government last week, we have got numerous employees who want to come back to the office because of their circumstances at home, etc., etc. And managing that, I think, is a challenge for us at the moment. not least because we don't expect offices really to be given the go-ahead for some weeks to come. That's in amongst the fact that we're, as an international law firm, we've had offices go back to work in other parts of the world this week. So people have seen what's going on in America, the different states, the different governor responses. You know, our 3 main offices in the US are all in Ohio. They've all gone back into the office this week. So that's quite interesting because it affects the expectations of your people. We've got offices in China. They've been back a few weeks. That allows us to learn a bit about what they've been doing. So that's quite good. But yeah, at the moment, because we feel we're some weeks away, we're planning at the moment. We're really focusing on trying to keep people away from the office because we've stayed open. We have got very small skeleton staff dealing with certain parts of our business which can't be done at home, particularly around reprographics, etc. And there are some old-fashioned books which we still need to look at, which are not online. So we've had to go and get them, for example. So we've sort of got a skeleton staff already, but yeah, keeping people away, managing their expectations, and just getting them tuned into what it's going to be look like when they get back. That it will be different, and they'll have to adapt. Lawyers are the worst at changing their ways. Very old profession, very, very old ways of working, and we're just trying to tune them in to what the new 6-foot office might look like.
Expectations and communication. There was one question, I'm not going to save it to the end. A lot of people have asked about air conditioning. Has anybody looked at air conditioning? Is that an issue that needs to be considered? I'd probably ask Chris, then Rob and Samir.
Yeah, I think that there is some conflicting advice about this, and depending on who you ask. I mean, we're taking the view that we have good air conditioning systems in our offices. There is a legal obligation to have sufficient fresh air intake and ventilation with those systems. So I think as long as you have a good system, a well-maintained system, and a reputable maintainer looking after them, then generally you should be okay. If you are able to introduce additional ventilation, that's probably a good thing. The key thing, I think, is a lot of these systems have been turned off or turned down over the lockdown. So, again, liaising with landlords to make sure that systems are brought back up, particularly if a tenant is responsible for its system on its floor that is hung off a whole building system, you have to liaise. So, critical to make sure systems are brought back onto full functionality before reoccupying an office.
Yeah, I mean, Chris has answered that very well. I mean, just remember the government guidance is essentially fresh air is good. If your system introduces fresh air, then it's a good thing to do. But you do need to make sure the system is the right sort of system and is working properly and correctly before you get people back.
All right, brilliant. Samir?
Yeah, exactly the same. We've taken the same approach, so yeah, nothing more to add there really, Luke.
All right, brilliant. I'll move on because, as I say, I know time is ticking. I think one of the key questions we're going to, if people can't be 2 meters apart, are there practical steps that you believe will manage that transmission risk? I think we've answered that, but I don't know if anyone would add anything else. We've talked about one-way systems and barriers. But any thoughts around sort of managing the transmission risk if you can't do 2 meters apart?
We've introduced body temperature screening. So it is currently in trial. So we don't know whether it's going to be rolled out, but I think that's quite a bold move. And whilst that's not enforceable, completely mandatory, I feel that is an absolutely fantastic control for viral transmission. So that's one thing.
I've had given all their employees when they start back a thermometer. Is it that kind of thing, or a thermometer?
These are the infrared, non-invasive, point to the forehead type contraption. But again, it's just one of those controls. And what we've done actually is we've implemented these controls in order then to see what we can relax. So if we've got, if we take on a belt and braces approach, we're almost saying, right, okay, this is, what can we relax? Are we able to relax the 2 meter social distancing rules because we've got other controls in place? So this is really looking ahead into the future, because clearly if we could relax a 2 meter distancing rule, that would make our operation a lot easier, really.
Yeah, no, I imagine. Anybody else in terms of that 2-meter rule, other practical steps to manage the transmission risk that you feel are useful to consider?
I wouldn't say there's any practical steps, but just I think we shouldn't avoid the thought that actually we do rely upon people's common sense. So, a lot of corridors aren't 2 meters wide. If you can't put in circulation spaces, you are just going to have to rely upon people keeping apart from each other. Now, if you can't put up screens, you are just going to have to rely on people understanding the risk and adapting accordingly. But that's no different from going to a supermarket to some extent.
Is this where masks would probably come in as something to consider when you were talking earlier about doing a risk assessment? Possibly,
yeah. Never get them. Generally, the face covering is more to do with not preventing you from getting the virus, but from preventing you from potentially helping to spread the virus.
Right. I will move on unless there's any other thoughts there. It was mentioned there's sort of 2 more slides and that's it. A lot of you got international offices. Are there any practical steps you've adopted from their approach? Any things that you've heard that have worked in other countries?
From our perspective, we are adopting cohort systems and shift patterns, and agreeing between the different teams in the office, the different practice groups, scheduling who's going to go in the office and when. The density of population in any single part of the day. So those are the key things we've adopted. We are also looking at masks for some of our offices. I mean, particularly, some of our American offices just have more space because real estate is so much cheaper in the US than it is in the UK. But it's all the things, all the control measures that people talk about. They're equally applicable in the office environment as others, but yeah, cohort systems and staggered systems of who's working when is what we're introducing. But actually, lawyers can work from home, so the starting point is keeping people at home.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, I know you've got a number of offices to look after across Europe. Is there anything you've seen, and we've got offices in China as well at Michael Page, that you've seen that's worked?
Absolutely, Rob. I apologise for talking over you there. Absolutely, a lot of the stuff that we would have talked about is based on guidance from our overseas colleagues. So I think particularly what's come out is the communication with colleagues and level setting the expectation before they come to the office, so they understand what they're walking into on day one. The appointment of office champions. A lot of businesses will have office managers, office coordinators anyway, but I think having someone as the designated point of contact on site to provide that link between the COVID planning team, the management team, and colleagues is really essential. And the checkerboard approach to desk allocation that has gone down well in other locations. People have adopted that very well. But as Rob said, the principle of elimination as a hierarchy of risk is key, and that is that people can work from home and don't need to come into the office. That is ultimately the safe thing to do. That's what we've adopted elsewhere. All
right. Thank you very much. And Sammy, I don't know if you've got international operations that you've learned things from.
We have, yes. So we've got equity-owned businesses in the US, France, and Hong Kong. So we have met weekly since all this kicked off. And really for us, it's more focused on shop openings, and market requirements are different in all those in all those countries. But for us, it's very much the sharing of the information, the controls. Masks are mandatory in Hong Kong, as is temperature monitoring. So it's just adopting the material that they've produced and making it fit our operation here in the UK.
All right. Brilliant, thank you guys. So there's definitely things to learn if you've got foreign offices and things to take from them, as well as communicating with them. I think this is the last slide. Sorry to put you guys on your to put you unawares, but what are your top 3 tips? If you had top 3 tips in terms of dealing with risk assessment and bringing your employees back to the office, if I start with you, Rob, top 3 tips from you?
Yeah, well, the first one is, because so many people are on the call relating to office spaces, stay at home for as long as you can. and analyse really whether it is actually making much difference on your efficiency. We're monitoring our efficiency with all of our staff working from home, and I suspect our conclusion will be any inefficiency is marginal. So yeah, first one is stay at home. Second one is manage people's expectations about getting them when, particularly when are they like to be back, and don't rush it. That's the third thing I'll say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, sure. I think my first one is don't wait for Boris. I suspect that when we do get the green light from the government to say actually, we now encourage people to go back to work where they can, it will be without notice. So I think, absolutely right. Don't rush your plans, but equally, plan now, get amongst it, and make sure that they're ready rather than waiting for a confirmed schedule. Collaboration is key. Talk to fellow tenants, talk to landlords. Plan your plans, but adapt them to suit sites so there's not a confused or conflicting message in multi-tenanted shared premises. And communication, provide assurance to your colleagues. Allow them to see what they're going to be walking into, get their feedback and make them feel that they're part of the planning as well. I think you'll get people who are more likely to follow the new workplace arrangements if their expectations are managed well in advance.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And Samir, before we move to some questions, your top 3 tips.
Mine would be key assessment, risk assessments are key. Ensure that it's an evolving document, ensure that it's revisited regularly as and when, hopefully things become more relaxed, but we need to be prepared for the worst as well. So ensure that that's a fluid document, ensure that everybody is aligned. So communication is key, as Chris has said. Ensure that your stakeholders understand what the current controls are, and to ensure that they're communicated in a consistent manner, whether that's through emails, central communications, team briefs at specific sites, or manuals and policies. So that would be my second tip. I think the third thing would always be listen to your people. Prep looks, is very much an employer that cares for its workforce. If there's any staff welfare issues, if there's anything, we've even said that if team members are looking after vulnerable people, if they consider themselves vulnerable without any evidence required, then they should stay at home. There is no requirement for you to come back into shops or back into the office.
I think that's one of the key premises about this, is making sure they're safe and make sure they feel safe, as well as the kind of the legal obligations. So thank you, guys. That's 3 tips for everyone, which seem to mirror each other in many ways. We've run over quite a lot, but there's a few questions. Are you all free just to answer a couple of questions that have come up?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll run through a couple of them. So one of them is, do you know if risk assessments are required in other European countries? And this person said assume yes, but if so, do you know what information on which countries? So I presume that's quite a long answer, and we can go back to them. But do you need to do risk assessments outside of the UK? I presume that would be Rob.
Yeah, you do. I mean, they might not be as prescribed in law in the same way as what the management regulations do, but the management regulations are part of what was called the six-pack regulations, which were introduced by Europe some years ago, I think in the 90s. I think you should presume that all European Union countries require some form of risk assessment. And frankly, as a matter of health, safety, practice and management, without the risk assessment, you're going to struggle to get all your control measures identified in any case. So it's good practice, even if there were to be a country, which I'm not sure I know of any, where you don't have to do a risk assessment. So the simple answer is yes.
I'll ask you if there's a link or something, and we'll send it out to the panel after this. Another one that's come up is about what's the legal requirement for health and safety from working from home? Is there a risk assessment required to make sure those working from home during this crisis are looked after as well? It's come up a couple of times. So I'd ask Chris. I'll jump in and ask you guys.
Okay, absolutely. I don't want to talk over someone. Yes, I mean, there is an obligation to look after your employees working from home as if they're in the office. Clearly, there's delineation between responsibilities. So I would advise anyone that hasn't got a home working policy or a procedure to draft one. That there's plenty of examples on the internet. And a home working risk assessment. The clear one that jumps out, of course, is workstation assessment. but again, the concept of reasonableness comes in. And again, if the home worker is only going to be working home temporarily, how long's temporary? Well, who knows? The different requirements apply. But I think, again, it all comes down to moral obligation. So I think a workstation assessment and just widening up to make sure that the home working environment is safe and suitable. If someone's working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, perched on the end of their bed with a laptop, clearly that's suboptimal. If someone is able to sit at a dining table in relative comfort and is quite happy with that arrangement, and carried out giving them advice on workstation ergonomics, then again, in my view, that's sufficient.
I pass that probably over to Rob next.
Well, no, there should be. I mean, Chris is absolutely right. There should be a work from home policy. The risks associated with that need to be assessed. There's good practice guidance, etc., from the HSE on this already. What I will say is there was a bit of confusion because of the scramble to get everybody working from home. There was a belief that the HSE said you don't need to risk assess it. I'm not sure that is what the HSE said. The HSE was sort of just indicating that they'd be a little bit relaxed in the rush to get everybody home, but that you should be assessing it. And actually, the longer you're at home, the more need for a risk assessment, particularly around the risk of mental health issues with people working from home. So yeah, it does need to be assessed in my view.
Brilliant, thank you guys. And one last question, which was a specific one, was and quite a unique one, I imagine. Is there any guidance about bringing over 70s back to work? This is one particular point. I presume this relates to people who are in a vulnerable situation coming back to the workplace. And I'd probably pass that over to you, Rob, to start off with.
Well, I think there's an argument, a discussion piece over what is a vulnerable person and what's an extremely vulnerable person, because the government sort of changed their guidance and their definitions. I mean, Samir just touched on it. It's absolutely right. If you have employees who are in that sort of most vulnerable category, then at the moment bringing them into work is probably unsafe for them. And most employers, as I know, are allowing those employees not to come back to work, and they're looking to reassign them where they can. It probably becomes a matter of employment law in due course as to whether or not they are capable of working, depending on how long this virus lasts with us. But at the moment, for those people over 70 and the others who are extremely vulnerable, I would guess it's not a safe environment, so they shouldn't be at work.
Yep. So that would be a risk assessment and then keeping them at home. Anybody else?
So I was going to say the government's guidance does cover this. There is a specific guidance note on how employers should be dealing with the extremely vulnerable category. And I've seen industries also, I've seen a number of risk assessments across a number of industries, and they all have a section on dealing with the extremely vulnerable employee.
And so we put the over 70s in that category, obviously, in this case, or for assessment purposes. There's not much time left. We've gone over. Everyone's been very patient. Thank you very much for the audience that stayed on, and for our experts who've probably got many other things to do. So I've kept them on by probably trying to get through too much. It's just testament. So it's one of those areas where there's so many questions and so many different viewpoints. So I'm glad we've kept most of the audience here for most of this, and we've gone over. We will send the slides out. If there's any particular questions I can try and address to those people that weren't answered, I will try. And we'll try and come back to you with a second in the series of these Unlocking the Lockdown, where we hopefully will have some answers on employment issues that are coming up in relation to furlough, redundancy, and all sorts of other things, whether I should come back to work if I don't want to. So can I thank the expert panel, Samir, Chris, and Rob. Thank you for your time. And as I say, if there's any extra questions, I'll pass them out, see if we can answer them. But at that point, I would finish off this webinar. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope it's been useful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.